There we go. Oop, I'm live. I have to say, just to start, that I am really relieved that when you were all voting on tracks and I was the only option, I still made it into the big room. I was a little bit nervous there, and they're like, oh, we're going to vote on rooms. I'm like, please don't put me in the small one. I'm the only person speaking. Well, with that, my name is Christina Lee, and I'm here to keynote, and you are all stuck with me. And the topic today is going to be sports and programming. I'm really excited about this because for those of you who don't know, psychology and the sports psychology in particular are one of my favorite things to research. I spend all my free time reading about psychology when I'm not coding. So, to get started, first there was a mommy and then there was a daddy. No, just kidding. But this is a picture of my family. Actually, there's one more, but he's photo shy, so I just, kind of drew him in there. And the reason I'm showing you this photo is that this guy kind of started this whole keynote. And it's fun to focus on him because he's kind of a ridiculous person, like basically every day. And also I realized I shouldn't have keynoted right before Christmas because I'm a little bit worried I'm not going to get a Christmas present anymore from him. But the point here is that this is my older brother, and I actually admire and respect him a lot, and we have a ton of conversations about career. He's very, very wise, and he kind of guides me against my worst judgments at times. But one conversation we had about 8 months ago, he said something offhand. It wasn't actually his main point, but he kind of threw something out there when we were talking about salary negotiations. And he said, in Silicon Valley, programmers are actually a lot like athletes. And what he meant by that was that we both have kind of ridiculous compensation packages in general, but also that because of those ridiculous compensation packages, both sports teams and companies are really keen to get the most out of us. And I had never thought of this parallel before. It had never occurred to me to think of myself as like a brain athlete, which I'm going to now term a brathlete. Yeah, you heard it here first. It had never occurred to me, and then once you start looking into it, you can find so many parallels. So yes, we all know about the ridiculous pay packages. I'm just jealous because that's not me. Someday. But when you dig past just the money issue, you actually start to see these things kind of like free agency. So when popular engineers leave their company, they usually announce it to the world in much the same way when an athlete leaves their team, it makes the news. And people engage with this. They're really keen to follow their favorite developers and know where they're going. Now, if you walk around with a famous developer, they will get stopped for autographs and photos. I know this because as the less famous counterpart, I'm usually the one who gets asked to take the photo. Yeah, fun. Now, we also, trash talk other teams. And then, of course, we have uniforms. I bet someone here is wearing their uniform. If you have a company hoodie on, can you raise your hand? Yes, someone's honest here. Okay, yes, we have uniforms. And while, sure, we don't have full stadiums of people to come and watch us, we can get pretty darn close. Now, there's one thing, though, that is pretty different, and that is that we don't get entourages. And I think that's a little unfair. But when you look at professional athletes, they have a team of people surrounding them trying to increase their output on any dimension: sleep, nutrition, strength, their mindset, etc. And meanwhile, over in programming land, we still think it's totally cool to smash Red Bulls, eat from the unlimited candy bar, and stay up all night. Yeah. Now, companies know that this is probably not great for us. For instance, my company has a nutritionist. I know this because about a year ago, she had to get up at our company all hands and explain why we were not allowed to have Nutella in all of our kitchens. Something, nutritional value, something. I know, disappointing. Now, places like Google get pretty close, or at least a lot closer than most others, to this sports entourage ideology in that they have on-site masseuses, they have yoga, they have meditation. But having been at Google, I can tell you that they still stay up really late and still eat junk food. So they're not quite there. And this brings me to this realization that I had, that when athletes take the field, they have a very solid conceptualization of their body and their musculature as the output that they are selling. And we as brathletes don't usually have that same ideology around the output of our own mind. For instance, I come into work all the time and people tell me, yeah, I was up late binging Netflix. And side note, there is a horrifying interview with the CEO of Netflix online where he says that his main competitive rival is sleep. So he's winning. Congrats, Netflix CEO, you're winning. Wow. But anywho, you hear a lot of people saying that they didn't go to bed because they were up late watching TV. And it's really extremely hard for me to imagine that somewhere the people playing in the World Cup were rolling in the day before their matches and saying, I was up all night, I just had to catch the last episode of XYZ. And you might be saying, okay, but that's like not totally fair because they're using their muscles and we're using our brain and they're different. And here's what I have to say, which is that science disagrees with that statement. Because actually, we know that the human brain can grow and change as a response to exercise. And actually, we know this in part from a study on London taxi cab drivers, in which they measured the brain size, or the size of a particular part of their brain, before and after they studied for this exam, and they found a huge growth in a region called the posterior hippocampi, which I just totally butchered. But the point is that it controls how you navigate. And so when they practice navigating, the part of their brain controlling navigation grew. The same way if you lift weights, your bicep grows. Now, we see this ability to bulk up in the brain in a lot of other regions as well. So for instance, in mathematicians, we see that they have more gray matter in the area that controls mathematical reasoning. And you might be saying, yes, I already knew that people had minds for numbers. I told my math teacher that in 3rd grade. But crucially, science did not find that they were born this way. They actually found that the size of that piece of their brain, the amount of gray matter there, was a relation to how long they had exposed themselves to mathematical concepts. The more practice they had, the more gray matter they had in that part of the brain. Likewise, with musicians, we find that their brains react to musical training in a way that actually makes them better at playing music. Their fingers get more sensitive if they're a string instrument player. They have more dexterity in the way they can move their hands. Their hearing gets better. Their brain actually makes them physically better at playing music than any of the rest of us who don't have training. And just like a muscle, we also know that our brain gets tired. We actually have a finite amount of willpower, and unfortunately, it's not just a character trait that we can say we're going to power through something. It is a muscle that tires out. Now, how do we know that? Well, there's something called the attention restoration theory. And what this says is that when you use directed attention, there is a limited supply and you can exhaust it, and if you exhaust it, you're going to pay the price in an inability to concentrate. The way they measured this was they had people walk through a city. Now that doesn't seem very taxing, but you have to think when you're walking through a city, you're trying not to get hit by a bus, and that's kind of concerning. So it does take attention, especially as compared to something like walking through nature. And indeed, we found that I just put myself in as a scientist. Yes, I found this. The scientists found that people who walked through nature as opposed to a city actually had 20% better performance when they did a concentration task. And this is to illustrate the fact that if you are using up concentration somewhere, it is affecting your performance on concentration elsewhere. So the science here is extremely clear that the brain is a muscle just like your hamstrings or your quadriceps or your bicep, which makes this obsession with Red Bull particularly ill-advised. So if you agree with me and you think, okay, I'm with you, maybe we should change a few things about the way we conceptualize brain work, then boy, do I have a keynote for you. So where do we start? Well, athletes don't get famous, just right off the bat. They usually start on a playground somewhere. They start with practice. And so that's where we'll start too. Now, the first point I want to make about this is there is no evidence that you can become great at something without practice. And maybe this seems obvious, but It's actually not when you hear people talk about elite athletes, because we always hear these things about people being born for it, that they were just born to do this thing. And actually, when scientists go in and try to measure this, they are finding no evidence that that is true. Indeed, not only are they finding evidence that that is not true, they're finding evidence that if you are a young child and you happen to be a little better at something right off the bat, you can be at risk of falling behind in that skill. And the reason you're at risk of underperforming is because if something comes easily to you right off the bat, you don't learn to practice. And if you don't learn to practice, then the people who do learn to practice pull ahead of you. So not only are you not born with it, but it can be a detriment to have things come easy to you. Now, this is actually one of my favorite quotes that is in this entire slide deck. And it says, "Ultimately, the body and the brain's natural ability to adapt in the face of challenges outweighs any genetic difference that may, in the beginning, give some people an advantage." This is the ultimate, growth mentality quote, right? You can do anything if you dedicate yourself to practice. But what is the point of practice? What do experts have that we don't? What are we practicing for? And it turns out that what experts have is mental models. They have retrained their neural circuitry to have these very, very elaborate mental models of the field in which they have mastery. And so one way we can study this, and actually one way they did study this, was they took a bunch of elite soccer players and they played a game, and right before a play, they paused the video. And then they asked, what's going to happen? And it turns out that the better players had an ability to interpret what was going to happen on the field, which, of course, allowed them to predict and perceive the movements of other players, which made them have better decision-making capabilities. So these were people that just saw a snippet of a play, and without seeing the rest of the play, were able to extrapolate what would happen and where people were on the field. And that was because of their finely tuned mental models of what should happen in a soccer game due to their years of training. Now, there's something else about mental models that's really key, and that's that it helps us overcome limitations of our short-term memory. Your short-term memory is a small itty-bitty buffer that you can basically transcode into your larger server via the process of sleep. But while you're awake, you have this little bit of capacity. And so if you don't have a mental model, what you're doing is you're taking these disparate pieces of information and you are encoding them one by one. And because your short-term memory can only encode a few bits of information, some people like to quote that number at 8, you can only hold about 8 of these disparate facts when you encode and decode them. If you have a mental model which ties all of this information into one, you can kind of get out of that limitation of only being able to hold 8 bits of knowledge. So this is why mental models are extremely, extremely key. They help us overcome this limitation of our short-term memory. And it turns out that the more you study a subject, the more detail you can store in your mental representations. And because we were just talking about the fact that this helps you overcome some limitations of your short-term memory, this actually makes it easier to learn, which is wild because that is a very virtuous cycle. That learning gives you a mental model, and having a mental model makes it easier to encode data, which makes it easier to learn, which gives you a mental model, and so on and so on. This is a very virtuous cycle. And it's also why you see people at the top of our field seem to know everything. They got to the top of our field because they had finely tuned mental models, and because they have finely tuned mental models, it makes it way easier for them to learn new information. So, how do we build mental models? If we've decided that's what experts have that we don't, how do we get there? Now, you may say, okay, let me look back at childhood. What did I do? Well, I don't know about your childhood, but I had flashcards when I was a kid and basically had this ethos of just do it over and over again and you'll learn the vocab words. And unfortunately, science says that this is a really bad idea because this ethos around trying harder, it doesn't work when the skill is very complex, which is the skill set that we're dealing with as brathletes. Now, something else you might say is, well, you're on stage giving a lecture, so maybe lectures are the way to go. Well, so in a study of medical professionals, they actually found that didactic interventions, aka lectures, were the least efficient way to learn. It's fine, don't ask questions. I'm still on stage, you have to listen to me. And this is really, really unfortunate because, of course, lectures are one of the most common ways we learn. It's definitely the basis for the US education system. I know that I studied in Australia, it was the same. And this is because it is way easier to convey knowledge than it is to transmit or teach someone how to do a skill. And yes, I'm totally subtweeting myself here. It's okay, I'm just being honest. And you might be saying, oh, this is so awkward. We just paid so much money to come and watch lectures. And what I want to point out about this point that I'm making is that the specific issue that I'm pointing out with lectures is that in and of themselves, they are not enough to give you a mental model, and they are not enough to help you build a mental model because they don't include feedback. Right now, I am speaking at you, and you are not able to ask me questions. But that doesn't mean that you won't be able to ask me questions after this, or that you won't be able to use the Pac-Man principle to have conversations with the people around you, or that you won't be able to do something like Corey is doing over in the corner, which is sketchnoting, and assimilating that information, tying it to pictorial representations, and encoding it in your brain for long-term retrieval. So while lectures themselves may not give you feedback, you can add feedback and still end up in a place where you are doing meaningful practice and movement towards a mental model. But let's say you don't like talking to people, so that doesn't work for you. If not repetitions and lectures, then what is the ideal way to develop mental models? Well, it turns out that it's something called deliberate practice. And if you've heard of this, you might know that the definition is extremely long and has a lot of points about skills that people have figured out, getting outside your comfort zone, specific goals, getting feedback, building on each other. But for us, the key thing here is actually this first point, which gets really awkward because deliberate practice actually only works in realms where there is a definition of mastery. So music and chess come to mind here. But there is no concrete definition of mastery for the field that we are in, which is software engineering. If you all figure out who you think an expert is, it is highly likely that you will not agree because there's no objective measure for what it means to be a master at engineering. So that's awkward. But there is a saving grace for us, which is that we can just try to get as close as possible. And if that doesn't seem very convincing, I assure you that that flippant statement actually is not so flippant, because we found that people who tried to get as close as possible to deliberate practice, which is something called purposeful practice, they actually were able to change students' understanding to 2x their learning within a module in a college university class. So this was not something that deliberate practice applies to, because in teaching there is no idea of an expert either. It's not like a set thing that you can evaluate people on. But just attempting deliberate practice and the methodologies around it allowed them to 2x their student output in terms of learning potential. So how do we approximate this in our industry? Well, we identify the experts. They will be the ones signing autographs and taking photos. Just find me and I'll point you to them. And then we decide what sets them apart. So this is something that each of you will have to do. You're going to have to figure out, why do you think they are an expert? And then you're going to have to practice that thing. One thing, not many things. One particular thing that you think that they have that you do not. And then you need to get feedback, and you need to practice again, and get feedback, and practice again, and get feedback, and practice again. Because you cannot have purposeful practice without feedback. That's just practice. That's just repetition. If you have purposeful practice without feedback, you are just trying the same thing, and you are not moving forward. So you really, really need feedback as part of this cycle. And as software engineers, this should horrify you, because of course, we almost never get feedback. I don't know about you, but in our company, we do once, or if, at most, twice a year feedback cycles. Twice a year. This is ridiculous. Can you imagine an athlete going and playing an entire season of their sport, and then on the last day of the season, their coach sits them down and says, all right, champ, so in the last 8 months, here are the things that you did well, and here are the things you didn't do well, and please apply those to next season. I'm expecting good improvement. That would be ridiculous. They would never get better, ever. But that's what we do as software engineers. We sit down at the end of the year and they list out the whole year and then they say, all right, see you here next year. And so in the NFL, I'm from America, as you can tell, so the NFL is one of our professional sporting leagues. There is a concept of the Monday morning quarterback. And this is actually kind of a disparaging concept. Like, if people say you're Monday morning quarterbacking, it's not a compliment, so don't be friends with that person. But what it encapsulates is this idea that football games used to be played on Sundays. And so the Monday morning quarterback is you play your game on Sunday, and then the very next day you come in and you watch tapes of that game, and you evaluate them, and you pick them apart, and you find every detail of what went wrong, and you build out your practice schedule for the next week, and you say, here's what I'm going to work on before the next game. So while this is kind of a disparaging term, it's actually exactly what science tells us is the right approach to take. So tell that next time someone calls you a Monday morning quarterback. So how can you fake this for yourself? Well, there are a couple ways you can do this. You can set up your own perf reviews. I know that's so fun. I know you want to do that. Yeah, it's great. Yeah. But I'm serious. So one of the researchers on this topic says basically you should be setting up your own monthly perf reviews, and you should be setting goals for that month, and then you should be very brutally honest with yourself about whether you achieve those goals. Or you can start using code reviews as deliberate practice. You can tell your teammates, here's one thing that I am working on as a software engineer. In every piece of code I put up, please give me feedback on how well I am doing that one thing. Or if you are like me and you like to do public speaking, perhaps you want to get rid of filler words. But, and. If you want to do that, you can tell your teammates that, and you can go into meetings and you can say, if I use a filler word, please raise your hand. Now, raising their hand does not interrupt you in your meeting, but it gives you feedback that you just said a filler word, because these are things that we don't usually notice in our own speech patterns. Or you can have them tally it, and your goal can be to reduce the number of times they wave their hand at you or the number of tallies on that paper. Now, if all of this sounds very hard, it is because it is. Unfortunately, becoming a master at something is not easy, otherwise we would all have done it. But, the good news is that even the experts among us cannot hold this practice for more than about 4 hours a day. If you are starting out and you have not wired your brain this way, you can maybe get an hour. But the experts who have been training, they still top out at 4 hours. So you'll be out of your misery pretty fast. Someone was paying attention to that statement. There is a very good reason, though, to put yourself through this. And this is because if you have the discipline to practice appropriately, you will outperform. We find that self-discipline is actually a better predictor than IQ in success factors. And indeed, the limits of purposeful practice are astonishing. So there was this study that just really opened my mind because they took people with a physical issue. They had trouble differentiating things close to their face. So their eyes had lost some elasticity and they weren't able to focus on things that were near their face and they were fuzzy. They had these people come in for deliberate practice every day for several weeks, and they showed them blurry images and they said, try to make out this figure. I know that it is blurry, but focus and try to make it out. And the results were astonishing. And remember, this is a physical defect with their eyes. They were able, at the end of this study, to read text that was 60% smaller. They were able to read it faster. And they were every single person in this study, able to read a newspaper without glasses after this study, a thing that most of them could not do before they started deliberate practice. So remember, their eyes had lost the ability to focus, but they rewired their brain to make sense of that fuzzy signal so that they could see again. This is wild. And this is just to say that not all defects can be overcome with hard work and a work mentality, but that really, really incredible things are possible with the power of your brain if you put in the effort and the training. So, deliberate practice. If you stick with it, extreme things are possible, but it's tiring. Where does this leave us? Well, this leaves us asking, when someone asks us to do a tiring thing, how do we decide not to quit it? And this brings me to this quote, which I really love, which says, when you quit something you initially wanted to do, it's because the reasons to stop eventually came to outweigh the reasons to continue. And so, if we want to do a hard thing because we know it's worthwhile and we know it's what experts in our field have, we need to bump up the reasons to continue. And one way to do that, and the scientist who was doing this deliberate practice research tells us this, is that it is very, very key to get motivation either internally, your self-satisfaction at being good, or externally, your teammates telling you that you're a star. It's very important to get that or you're likely to quit because, again, we've established deliberate practice is not easy or fun. So that brings us back to athletes, because athletes are a great case example of this. They spend months and years of their life doing really hard things, doing conditioning, sprints, weightlifting, really monotonous trainings where they do the same thing until they can get it right. And yet they continue to do that. And so why? Well, if you ask most athletes, they'll say they live for the game. They are waiting for that moment where they can compete, and all of those months of training will be worth it when they get to that one particular moment. And so you might be saying, yeah, that seems okay for athletes, except for I don't know that I'm going to study linked lists for 6 months just for the day that I show up at the office and I get to use them. And I will say, you may think that, but science says that actually, when measured empirically, people are so much happier at work than they think they will be and less happy at home than they expect. And further, the studies show that the more flow experiences that occur in any given week, the happier people are. They conclude human beings, it seems, are at their best when immersed deeply in something challenging. Now, the really ironic takeaway from that is actually that because work is set up in a way that we have built-in goals and feedback and challenges, it is easier to get into a flow state at work and thus easier to be happier at work than in your spare time watching Netflix instead of sleeping. This is pretty wild because people usually think that all they're doing is waiting for the time they get off work. And again, all of this boils down to the concept of flow. More flow experiences, more happiness. And with athletes, this is great because it turns out that when they go on stage to compete, they have optimal experiences for getting into flow. Whole stadiums are looking at them and asking them to focus. Everybody wants them to focus. And when they're on the sidelines, they are not thinking about childcare or scheduling their next dry cleaning pickup or answering emails. They are in that game, in that moment, competing. Now, for people in our field, things are a little bit different. We have these things called open office plans. And basically what that means is that anybody at any time can start a conversation right over your shoulder and distract you, or they can poke you on the shoulder and distract you. And basically this is just a giant room full of distractions. But it's okay because we take time away from the giant room full of distractions to go to smaller rooms full of distractions called meetings. And a fun fact about meetings is that they always look way more productive in stock photography than they do when you're actually in them. I know, it's wild. But then, don't worry, because we can get out of the small and the big rooms. But there are virtual rooms full of distractions too. I know, it's so great. And so these virtual rooms, of course, I'm talking about Slack and email and instant messaging and Twitter and Facebook and all of these things that are on the laptop. And for us, we need laptops because we are programmers. We cannot get away from it. So these things are literally on the same device. It's like if you had a soccer ball with Twitter on it and then you told someone to go and play a soccer match. Yeah, it's not very good. And worst of all, is that we work in a field where our output is very nebulous because it's from our brain. And so what this means is that because we don't have something like score a goal, you did well, we have something like do brain things, maybe you did well, we have this scenario where these busyness factors are starting to get accounted for as a sign of our productivity, despite the fact that being busy is exactly when we're least productive. So even if you wanted to, go and sit in a library and skip all your meetings and not answer email, you can do that, but you better have a really understanding boss. Because while science says that's what's going to make you most productive, your boss will probably disagree. So this is a little bit sad, and good thing, it's only going to get worse. So, I know, you thought I was going to say it got better, right? I'll get there eventually. But say we take this equation as fact. This is an equation that was proposed by Cal Newport. And we look specifically about the intensity of focus portion of it. Well, studies show that people in offices switch tasks every 3.5 minutes. They studied people like us, software engineers, people in the financial industry, office workers just like us. 3.5 minutes. Every 3.5 minutes, we are changing topics. Now, every 10.5 minutes, we are changing entire spheres of work. So this means, like, if you're doing a bunch of tasks around project A, you will switch to project B and do tasks around that. Entire spheres of work every 10.5 minutes. And this is wild. And before you decide, I knew my coworkers were no good, I'm throwing them off the bridge, well, check yourself in the mirror, because half of these interruptions are self-imposed. And if you're thinking, I do not do that, how many of you went on Twitter last time Gradle took 10 minutes to build? That's right. That is right. We do this to ourselves, ladies and gentlemen. So, it gets a little bit worse, which is that on average, it takes us 23 minutes to recover from these interruptions and to go back to what we were doing. So is that email that you are going to check right in between something worth 23 minutes of your time? Because on average, that's how much it's taking away from you. Now, after hearing all these facts were presented in this Q&A format. The interviewer looked at the scientist and they said, oh my goodness, okay, so do you think, in your scientific opinion, that we're becoming more superficial thinkers? And the scientist who had done all this research said, I argue that when people are switching context every 10.5 minutes, they can't possibly be thinking deeply. There's no way people can achieve flow. When I write a research article, it takes me a couple of hours before I can even begin to think creatively. If I was switching every 10.5 minutes, there'd be no way I could think deeply about what I was doing. This is really bad for innovation, because when you're on a treadmill like this, it's just not possible to achieve flow. It's just not possible to achieve flow. We know that flow is key to our happiness and key to our performance, but our offices are impinging upon this. Now, not only is it taking away from our happiness, but we know that people who get interrupted often, like those of us who are switching tasks every 3.5 minutes, have increases in stress, in mental strain, and in frustration. So we're taking away happiness opportunities and we're swapping them out with things that stress us out. Now, if we put on our pessimism pants, which I love to do, we could say businesses aren't in the business of caring about our happiness or stress. And to that I'll say, if we go down, we're taking them with us. So businesses suffer because of this as well. Sure, it's not their happiness, but it turns out that there's this concept called attention residue. And attention residue is what happens when you switch tasks, but that previous task is still yammering in your ear. You're still thinking about it a little bit. And it turns out that attention residue is particularly damaging if the task that you're leaving is unfinished. So you started to type something, and then someone comes in and says, hey, can you do this? That is a particularly damaging form of attention residue. And it turns out that people experiencing attention residue turn out to be poorer performers on their next task because there is a part of their brain that is still thinking about the task that they left. And in addition, when they observed knowledge workers in real offices, they found that an interruption, even if short, delays the total time required to complete a task. So businesses, because of attention residue, because of task switching, are getting people who are poorer performers and taking longer to do tasks. Now, we can keep our pessimism pants on for a little bit longer and say, there's two parts of this equation. There's surely the focus one, which we're definitely failing at, but there's always time spent. If I'm a business, I don't care how long it takes you, just get it done. But unfortunately, you can't just ratchet up time spent, because again, the brain is a muscle that fatigues, and this is a limited commodity. And if we revisit art and know that is not the runtime, that is the attention restoration theory, if we revisit that, we know that if you don't allow your concentration centers to replenish, then you fare poorly on follow-up tasks that require concentration, which is to say that if you go home and you continue to work, you could be damaging your ability to do work the next day enough that if you had just taken time off, you would have performed better the next day. Now, another reason that time and ratcheting up the time involved in work is a horrible idea is because a lot of times people use more work time in place of sleep. And if you are thinking even a tiny bit, even just a little bit about skipping sleep, I will say absolutely 100%, please do not do that. Just don't do it. This is a great way to take something that is really bad and make it catastrophically bad. And there is a book that is life-changing. It is called Why We Sleep. I recommend it to all of you. But because that would take like a whole hour to talk to you about sleep, I'm just going to go through some of the bullet points of why skipping sleep is absolutely not something you should do to make up for lost work. 1, sleep is a known carcinogen. The World Health Organization classifies it as such. People who sleep 6 hours or less have a 40% increased cancer rate over those who sleep 7 hours or more. 40% extra cancer. That's really bad, you all. Really bad. And people who skip their afternoon naps, which we're biologically wired for, that is probably everybody in this room, unless you have a great boss, show a 60% increase in mortality factors. Now, that's also really bad. But additionally, skipping sleep makes you sick. If you are exposed to a flu virus, like all of us are in office buildings, you are 2.5 times more likely to get sick from that exposure if you have been sleeping 5 hours or less compared to people who sleep 7 hours or more. 2.5 times more likely to get that flu virus when exposed. It also makes you gain weight. It turns out that a sleep-deprived mind emits the same chemicals found in marijuana. Now, people who smoke pot or know something about pot know of the phenomenon called the munchies. This is exactly what is happening to your brain if you do not give it enough sleep. Now, speaking of being under the influence, it also makes you act drunk. We're just going to go for the trifecta here, which is to say that people who have been awake for 19 hours is not that much. That is getting up early to go to work on a Friday and still being out at like 1 or 2 a.m. with your friends. Even if you have not drank anything at all that day, you are as cognitively impaired as someone who is legally drunk after being awake for 19 hours. Now, it gets worse. It also makes you emotionally unstable. So people who don't have sleep, they have a 40% increased reactivity rate in their amygdala. The amygdala is that part of your brain that controls fear responses. So if your coworkers have not been sleeping, they are going to be on a pin trigger, things that will make them angry or scared or feel attacked. And it's not going to be you, it's going to be because their amygdala is telling them scary, run, attack. 40% increase in amygdala activity. And then, of course, the one that we all know, it decimates your memory. I talked about this earlier. You can only offload memories from that small short-term memory buffer when you are asleep. If you do not sleep, you cannot offload them into your long-term memory, and so you either have to overwrite what is in your short-term memory buffer or stop making new memories. Those are your options if you don't go to sleep. So there's a 20 to 40% memory retention benefit when you sleep properly. Okay. So if you're thinking, yikes, those are all really terrible, but I'm mostly a good sleeper, I just like every once in a while skip an hour or two, you're not spared. So it turns out that if you sleep 7 hours for less than 2 weeks, so 7 hours every night, most of us think that's pretty good, but for less than 2 weeks, just 1 hour reduction of sleep is the same as pulling an all-nighter, cognitively speaking. And reminder, An all-nighter, that's like 24 hours awake. We know that at 19 hours awake, you are cognitively impaired to the level of someone who is drunk. So if you are sleeping 7 hours a night for less than 2 weeks, you are back to that space of cognitively being at a level of a drunkard. And if you are saying, I sleep 7 hours and I am not drunk, well, that is also because when the human mind is sleep deprived, it cannot properly evaluate how sleep deprived it is. So if you are thinking this does not apply for you, it is because you are sleep deprived and the human brain cannot evaluate its own sleep deprivation, science has shown. Yes. So, ignore this at your own risk. I talked to someone yesterday who said, I know sleep is so important, but I just still don't get enough. And you know, athletes have made that mistake too. So my hometown hero, Andre Iguodala, he plays in the NBA, he's a basketball player. He had years of poor sleep. And when he finally addressed this problem, it turned out that his three-point shot percentage doubled. This is huge for a professional athlete. You don't see gains like this. His points per minute spiked 29%. His turnover and foul rates fell 37 and 45% respectively, and his coaches had enough confidence in him that they asked him to guard one of the best NBA players of all time in the NBA final, and he did it, and he was voted MVP. This was someone who was already a professional athlete. He did not have a lot of room to go up from there. He was getting by without sleep. And even at this level of being a professional athlete, when he mitigated his sleep issues, he went to a whole nother level. That is what we are leaving on the table if we give up sleep to pursue work. So, we know that disrupted work is bad and giving up sleep and free time to try to recover it is bad. What do we actually do? Well, the good thing is that it only takes we can really only have a capacity for 1 to 4 hours of focus time, and a workday is 8 hours long. So there's no inherent reason that you can't actually achieve this in a standard working day. The only problem is that a bunch of shallow work tasks usually crowd out the deep work tasks that we should be doing. So I want to present to you 5 science-based tips to optimize your workday. You won't believe number 2. First, this is one that I'm adding. I haven't established this fact, but science shows that people who are multitasking a lot lose, via their brain capacity, they lose the ability to determine what is irrelevant. They lose the ability to determine what is irrelevant. So, when you think about your workdays, instead of saying, I'm going to go and get focus time, you should instead be regarding your entire workday as focus time and saying, I'm going to take time to check the internet. You should schedule that. So you can say, at 12 p.m., I will take 15 minutes to go check Twitter. That will be my relief. Instead of saying, at 12, I'm going to go hide in the library. I really need to get some focus work done. We also know that the ability to concentrate is a muscle that we need to train. So how do we do that? Well, train your memory, actually. Because memory athletes, when we study how they're different from normal people, it turns out that their memory is not different from us. Their level and ability to concentrate is. So a side effect of memory training is actually a general improvement in the ability to concentrate. So go out there. There are a lot of books on how to train your memory. One that the author of the book I was reading recommended was to memorize a deck of cards, which everybody has at home, and that'll help you train this muscle for concentration. Now, we also know that working on a single task helps you minimize attention residue. So block like tasks together. We know that unfinished tasks are particularly damaging to us, but one tip that you can use is that this effect was actually mitigated when you made a plan for how to get back to the interrupted task. So it's still pretty bad, we still have attention residue, but if you write down after your interruption, here is when I will do this task, you actually mitigate some of that effect. So consider doing that. And then also consider having a shutdown ritual. So a shutdown ritual will help you transition out of work mode more quickly at the end of the day. And the reason this is important is because we know that that free time is crucial to building up your brain capacity to be able to come into work and perform the next day. And then lastly, we know that people give up practice before they become experts. And one science-based tip to help you with that problem is to break down goals into smaller pieces. We've found that when people do this, that larger goal is a lot more likely to occur. So instead of saying, I want to become Jake Wharton, say, I want to understand build systems, and then pursue that. Now, say you do all of these things, what do you get? Well, fame, glory, and honor, of course. course, right? Of course, just kidding. Like, that's not in the cards for us, unfortunately. But if you remember those 3 photos I just flashed at you, there is one thing that they all share, and that is extreme, extreme happiness. And it turns out that we love what we're good at. Now, this actually flies in the face of common knowledge, because common knowledge is actually that we have passions, and that we just need to discover them. And if we find a job and it matches up with our passion, we will walk in and everything will be incredible. And really famous people in our industry, they espouse this hypothesis. So Steve Jobs' commencement speech to Stanford, it went viral for exactly this reason, saying like, follow your passion, stay weird. But the problem is that when you look at Steve Jobs' own history, this is not accurate. The founding of Apple is a very well-documented event, and it turns out it was basically a get-rich-quick scheme. Steve Jobs was incredibly interested in yoga and meditation and kind of health and wellness, but he needed to fund it, so he decided he would resell some computers to make some money so that he could do these things. And it turned out that reselling computers was really profitable, and it went on to found Apple. But he did not start with a burning passion for computers. And it turns out that if you study people, only 84% of them have passions, identifiable passions. So if we have this passion hypothesis that all we need is passion, well, 16% of the population is already left behind because they don't have a passion. And it gets worse because when you actually study how many people have passions that are monetizable, only 4% of the 84 have passions in areas that they can make a career out of. That's 96% of people who have passions in hobby areas that are unlikely to be monetizable or related to their career. So, it's not all bad. I told you I would bring it back around. It turns out that when you study people in common jobs like college admissions assistants, that their happiness actually most correlates to the number of years they spent in their role. Nothing to do with, I always knew I wanted to be a college admissions counselor, but instead, I've been here 10 years. I look at this as a calling. This is a calling, not just a job. And if all of this sounds like I'm just being really unfair to passion, the reason I felt like it was important enough to include is that this is causing mental harm to people, and I see it in our industry all the time. When you look at passion as your driving reason for being, you are looking at what a job can give you. It needs to be your passion. It needs to fulfill you. And that is a lot of pressure to put on a job, especially because most entry-level jobs will not offer that to you. This is a problem. We're seeing, ever since the study started tracking it in 1987, every year satisfaction rates with jobs are ticking down to the point that in 2010, 64% of millennials said that they were dissatisfied with their jobs. This is a lot of mental weight to carry. And now there's also these new movements where people are saying, the job is making you unhappy, just leave it. Like, go and become a blogger, travel the world. And unfortunately, this works out for a very small amount of people, but a lot of them get led to financial ruin. And it turns out that this behavior is actually undermining the exact thing that they want. So, the passion hypothesis is not exactly helpful for people in our career line. But what do we know about passion? Well, it's kind of hard to encapsulate, so we don't know a lot about passion itself, but we do know a lot about a related topic, which is motivation. Now, if you study motivation, you will come across something called the SDT, which is the self-determination theory. And what this says is that for people to be motivated, they need 3 things. They need autonomy, they need competence, and they need relatedness. Now, we'll take these in reverse order. Relatedness basically says that if you hate your coworkers, you will not be motivated. And anybody in this room who has worked with people that they hated probably is not surprised by this. Yes, it's very obvious. I know. And then the second point is one that we've actually covered pretty extensively, which is that if you can get into flow states, if you have mastery, you are going to enjoy that because you are good at it and because you have the ability to do it well. But Autonomy is the one we haven't yet touched on. This is the key piece to really bringing this together and kind of building this motivation to do a job that we love. And so when you look at autonomy, the results are just absolutely stunning. It turns out that if you ask people to do things that take self-control, they are far, far more tired when they think that they were doing it for you than when they think that it is their own idea. Now, further, people who are autonomy focused and who are self-motivated, they actually have a lot of great things. Higher self-esteem, better interpersonal relationships, and greater general well-being. And to just keep piling on all the goodness that comes from autonomy, there's also better conceptual understanding, better grades, better persistence at school and in sports, higher productivity, less burnout, and greater levels of psychological well-being. This is a pretty lengthy list for science. Like, you don't usually get this level of clarity on something like this. And of course, we can put back on our pessimism pants and say, well, do businesses care about that? Because that sounds like a lot more feelings that you're throwing at me. And yes, businesses that enabled their employees to feel like they had a sense of autonomy grew at 4 times the rate of those that did not and had 1/3 the attrition. So it's good for us to feel like we have autonomy, and it's really, really good for our business's bottom line to feel the same. So like, yay autonomy. This is so great. We found it. Like, give up the passion myth, find autonomy, happiness. Like, done, mic drop. Now, I'm going to take a moment to complicate this just a little bit, because all the way up until here, I've been talking about us as ICs, us as brathletes, and I haven't given any thought to coaches. So I want to conclude this talk by giving a little shout out to people that are coaches, aka managers. Now, if you are a manager, looking at these 3 things should fill you with joy, because all of these 3 things are things that fall within your job purview. So you have control over teams, you can help up-level people with skills, and you can definitely give them a sense of autonomy. Problem. It turns out that even with great intentions, things can be more delicate than they first appear. So take, for example, the autonomy bit. People often give rewards in the workplace. We know of these as like good things. You get retention bonuses and you get bonuses for referring people. But it turns out that actually a meta-study of studies on awards show that there is a significant negative effect on motivation when you give people a reward. And there's also pretty overwhelming evidence that if you give people financial incentives to do something, it will limit their problem-solving ability on non-trivial tasks. That is because when we dangle financial incentives in front of people, their mind shuts down and it focuses only on that, and they lose the ability for creative thinking. And so, yes, I'm actually making a case for the fact that rewards steal motivation and lead to decreased performance. But of course, it's more complicated than that, which is to say that this is only true if they're not administered correctly. So you can actually really easily correct for this by just not dangling money in front of people as if they are dogs chasing treats. Instead, you can give it to them specifically, unexpectedly, and after a task is complete, to not take away that self-motivation and to not make them feel like you said jump and they jumped just to get a paycheck. So the reason I include this as like a way to kind of complicate the issue is because I don't want managers to feel like they have a free pass. If you are an elite athlete and you have done all of this work to get to this point, but you have a bad coach, it's not going to go well for you. Great players don't flock to bad coaches. And likewise, coaches have the same ability to learn and progress and focus and get flow states as the rest of us. So all of this evidence that I presented today, it's not specific to us. So I just didn't want anybody to think that management was easy. It has all of the same issues, and even trying hard and having good intent is not enough to get us where we want to go sometimes. We have to think very critically, and we have to get feedback. There is no way for you to understand that giving rewards, which seems like a very natural thing, will undermine your team unless you study it. So like, wow, that was a lot. Let's review where we started from. So first, the brain is a muscle that can bulk up, adapt, and get fatigued. We started with that. Then we said people aren't born experts, but We also pointed out that practice can overcome any initial genetic differences, so people can easily become experts. And the way they do that is that they build mental models, because mental models allow people to parse information more efficiently, and that's what differentiates people from those who haven't studied. Then we said building models requires purposeful practice, which is predicated on both focus and feedback. And then we said also that work environments are unfortunately not set up to give us frequent feedback or allow for flow. But as a result, this means that we're underperforming our potential, and in some cases, we're trying to reel back in that potential by giving up things that are even more costly, like sleep and free time. Then we talked about how fixing this can give us time to focus and master our craft, and that the self-determination theory tells us that mastery and autonomy are key to happiness. So fixing these will give us the keys that we need to be happy. And also that a sense of autonomy is easily undermined if we are not careful. So that was a lot, and I'm just going to leave you with one final tip, which is this. Think about a sports team you hate. Yes, you hate. It is probably because they beat your own sports team. Yeah? Yeah. And so, I'm going to leave you with this one fact, which is that everybody hates a winner. So it turns out that people, if you follow these steps and you become a master in your field, you are prone to being disliked and to making people jealous of you. Except if you are generous with your time and talents. So go forth and be generous, you champions, you. Thank you.